A dying billionaire begs his virgin maid to spend one night with him. Because. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. It was a quiet night in New York City. Through the wide glass windows of the St. Clarion Private Hospital, the skyline shimmered with life. But inside the top-floor suite, silence wrapped around a dying man. Richard Hale, once the most powerful billionaire in the East Coast shipping industry, lay weak and pale against crisp white sheets. Machines hummed softly beside him, each beep reminding him that something he used to buy, bend, and control was finally slipping through his fingers. His empire stretched across oceans, but at that moment, all he had was the fragile rhythm of his breath and the faint scent of lilies by his bedside. And by that bedside stood Clara, his young maid, barely 22, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She had been working for him for only 6 months, a quiet, hard-working girl from a small town in Ohio. Her innocence showed in the way she spoke, soft, careful, never daring to look him in the eyes for too long. To the rest of the world, she was invisible. But to Richard, she had become the only person who still treated him like a man, not a dying investment. The doctors had told him he had less than 2 weeks. The painkillers dulled his body, but not his memories. Every night he would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the faces of people he had wronged, the lovers he had abandoned, the children who never called him dad. Tonight, though, he couldn't bear the thought of dying alone. As thunder rolled faintly in the distance, he whispered, his voice trembling, "Clara, please, stay with me tonight." The words hung heavy in the air, confusing her, freezing her heart. She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Sir, you mean? Stay to watch over you?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded weakly, his eyes glossy, with something she had never seen before, fear. Not arrogance, not command fear. "I don't want to die alone, Clara. Not tonight." His hand trembled as he reached for hers, his skin cold yet desperate for warmth. For a moment she hesitated. She had heard rumors about rich men and their last wishes. But when she looked at him, his sunken eyes, the way his breath rattled, she saw no desire, only loneliness, the kind that eats through the soul. "Please," he said again, his voice breaking. "Just stay. Talk to me like you do when you bring the flowers." Clara swallowed, tears stinging her eyes. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand gently. "All right, Mr. Hale," she whispered. "I'll stay." Outside, the city lights blurred as rain began to fall, streaking the glass like fading memories. Inside, the dying billionaire closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in years. He didn't know that this one night, this act of innocent mercy would unravel everything he thought he knew about guilt, love, and redemption. Clara sat by his bedside long after the machines had settled into their soft rhythm. The rain outside had turned into a faint drizzle. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue across the windowpane. Her hands were still holding his, her thumb brushing lightly over the veins that once pulsed with power and ambition. When she was a little girl, she used to believe that people who had everything were incapable of pain. Working for Richard Hale had shattered that belief. He was living proof that even the rich could be broken inside. The next morning, after he drifted into a quiet sleep, she left the hospital suite for a moment and walked into the hallway. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, mixed with faint coffee from the nurse's station. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. She had never been this close to death before. Not since her mother passed away when she was 15. Clara grew up in a small town in Ohio, in a creaky wooden house that smelled of rain and fresh bread. Her mother was a seamstress who worked late into the night, stitching clothes for people who would never remember her name. Her father left when she was 8, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and a broken radio that never worked again. Life had always been about survival, not dreams. After her mother died, she took care of her little brother, Nathan. He had a heart condition that required expensive treatment, and for years, she cleaned houses, served tables, and did any honest job she could find. When she got hired to work in Richard Hale's mansion as a maid, it felt like stepping into another universe. The marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and quiet halls were both beautiful and terrifying. Most of the staff avoided the billionaire. They whispered that he was cruel, impossible to please and ungrateful. But Clara had seen something else, a man who lived alone in a palace of glass, surrounded by silence. Every morning she would bring fresh flowers to his study. He never thanked her, but he never told her to stop either. One day, she overheard him coughing violently through the door. Without thinking, she rushed in and held a glass of water to his lips. He looked startled, as if no one had touched him in years. "You should rest, sir," she had said quietly. For a brief second, he stared at her like he was trying to remember what kindness felt like. From that day on, he began to notice her presence. Sometimes, she caught him watching her arrange the flowers. Other times, she would find the vase already filled before she got there. He never said a word, but something had changed. That fragile connection had followed them into the hospital, where wealth meant nothing anymore. She looked at him now, asleep and vulnerable, and wondered how someone could have so much yet be so empty. In her small apartment across town, she still had bills stacked on the counter and a letter from the hospital, reminding her that Nathan's next surgery was due in less than a month. She needed this job more than anything. But tonight, something had shifted inside her. He was no longer just her employer. He had become a person, a lonely, fading man clinging to the last thread of dignity. She whispered softly, almost afraid to wake him, "You are not alone, Mr. Hale. I am here." Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep across the city skyline. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled like rain. Somewhere deep inside her chest, Clara felt the smallest spark of something she had not felt in years: compassion without fear, care without expectation. She did not know that this quiet morning would soon lead her into the truth of who Richard Hale really was, and how their lives were bound together by a past she never knew existed. When Clara returned to the Hale mansion 2 days later to gather some of his personal belongings, the silence of the place struck her harder than ever. The massive oak doors opened into a hall lined with portraits of ancestors, men in black suits with watchful eyes and women draped in pearls and lace. It felt like walking into a museum of ghosts. She moved carefully across the marble floors, her reflection gliding beneath the grand chandelier that no longer sparkled as brightly without the master of the house to demand perfection. The staff had mostly been dismissed when Mr. Hale was hospitalized, leaving only the old butler, Harris, to manage the estate. He greeted her with a nod, his face pale with fatigue and grief. "He wanted you to have this," Harris said, handing her a small silver key. "It opens the west study. He spent most of his time there before he got sick." Clara hesitated, the cold metal resting in her palm, before making her way down the long corridor toward the western wing. The deeper she went, the dimmer the light became. Dust lingered in the air, and the smell of old books and cigar smoke wrapped around her like memory. She turned the key and stepped inside. The study was enormous walls lined with shelves that climbed toward the ceiling, every inch filled with books, photographs, and ledgers. A large wooden desk stood near the window, covered in papers, and a framed photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching. The woman's smile looked strangely familiar. The same soft curls, the same shape of eyes she saw in the mirror every day. She touched the frame with trembling fingers, her mind racing. Before she could think further, Harris appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat softly. "He never spoke much about the past," the butler said quietly. "But after you came to work here, he started coming into this room again. He would sit here for hours, just staring at that photograph." Clara looked down at the picture again, the realization pressing heavy on her chest. "Do you know who she is?" she asked. Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "All I know is that her name was Evelyn. She worked here a long time ago, before I did. He kept that photo locked away for years." Evelyn. That was her mother's name. The air seemed to drain from the room as the truth began to form in fragments she could barely hold together. Could it be? No, it was impossible. Her mother had never spoken about where she worked before meeting Clara's father. She had said it was in the city, but never gave details. Clara's thoughts blurred with memories, the times her mother would stop sewing and stare out the window, the quiet sadness in her eyes whenever Clara asked about her father. Maybe this was the secret she carried all along. Maybe Richard Hale had known. Clara sank into the leather chair behind the desk, her heart pounding. Outside, the wind rustled through the garden trees, whispering against the glass. For the first time, she noticed a folded envelope resting beside the photograph. Her name was written on it in shaky handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "Clara, there are things I should have told you long ago. If you are reading this, then I am gone. The truth is in the drawer beneath this letter. Forgive me." Her hands trembled as she pulled open the drawer. Inside was a bundle of old documents, medical forms, a birth certificate, and a faded letter signed by Evelyn Hale. The name sent chills down her spine. Her eyes darted across the page as tears welled up. Her mother had worked for Richard Hale 23 years ago, and Clara was born exactly 9 months after her resignation. The truth hit her like thunder. The man she was caring for was not only her employer, he was her father. She dropped the papers to the desk, her breath catching in disbelief. The storm outside beginning to rise again as if echoing the turmoil inside her heart. The sound of rain grew louder against the tall windows of the study, as Clara sat frozen in disbelief. Her mind replayed every moment she had shared with Richard Hale, the way he looked at her, the tremor in his voice when he said her name, the strange sadness in his eyes. It all made sense now, but it was too much to accept. The papers on the desk blurred behind her tears. She pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, but the room felt like it was closing in on her. She had lived her whole life believing her father was a nameless man who had left before she could remember him. Now she knew he had been there all along, living behind the gates of a mansion only a few miles from her old apartment, surrounded by everything she never had. For a long moment, she could not move. Harris remained at the doorway, watching her with quiet concern, but he said nothing. He had seen the truth written in her face. "Did he know?" Clara finally whispered. Her voice cracked like glass. Harris nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Clara. He found out about a year ago. When he first hired you, he did not recognize the connection. But later, after seeing your mother's old photo and noticing your resemblance, he began to suspect. He asked me to confirm it. I found the records for him." Clara swallowed hard, her tears falling freely now. "Why did he not tell me?" The old man's eyes softened. "Because he was ashamed. He said he had destroyed too many lives already. He wanted to make things right, but did not know how to begin." The confession hit her harder than she expected. Shame, guilt, love, and confusion all swirled together in her chest. She stood up abruptly, clutching the letter. "He begged me to stay that night," she murmured. "He wanted to tell me, but he was afraid." She could still hear his voice in the quiet of the hospital room, trembling with the truth he could not say aloud. For a long while, she walked through the halls of the mansion, touching the walls, the furniture, the traces of his life that suddenly felt like pieces of her own. Every step carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. When she reached the grand staircase, she paused, her reflection mirrored in the marble floor. It was the same house her mother must have walked through years ago, maybe even stood in this very spot, filled with dreams that were never fulfilled. Now Clara was standing where her mother once stood, holding the same sorrow in her hands. Later that evening, she returned to the hospital. The air inside was colder, and the rhythmic beeping of the machines had become slower. Mr. Hale was awake but frail, his face pale against the pillow. He turned his head weakly when she entered. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She stepped closer, her heart pounding with everything she had discovered. She wanted to scream, to demand the truth, to make him admit what he had done, but when she saw the fear in his eyes, all her anger melted into sadness. She took his hand gently. "I went to the mansion," she said softly. His breath caught. He did not ask what she found. He already knew. "I saw her photo," she continued, "and I found the letter." His eyes glistened with tears, and his hand trembled as he tried to speak. "I am sorry, Clara. I was a coward. I wanted to tell you that night, but I could not bring myself to say it. I hurt your mother. I left her when she needed me most, and you paid the price for my sins." Her chest tightened, but she did not let go of his hand. "You cannot change the past," she whispered, "but you can tell the truth." He nodded weakly, tears rolling down his face. "You have her eyes," he said, his voice fading. "She was the only person who ever saw me for what I was, and now you have given me peace." Clara lowered her head, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. The rain outside had stopped, but the sound of water dripping from the roof echoed softly through the window. For the first time, she realized that forgiveness could be both painful and healing at once. She whispered, her voice trembling but steady, "Then let us end it with peace, Father." He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips, and for the first time in decades, Richard Hale slept without fear. Clara stayed by his side as the hours slipped by, watching the frail rise and fall of his chest. The monitors blinked softly in the dim hospital light, marking time like the beating of a clock that was slowly winding down. Richard Hale drifted in and out of sleep, whispering fragments of memories, names, places, regrets that only he could see. Every so often, he would open his eyes and find her there, and a faint, grateful smile would form on his lips. She had never imagined her life would lead her here, sitting beside the man who had caused so much quiet pain yet carried it like a secret burden all his life. The weight of truth had crushed her at first, but now, in the stillness, she began to understand that her mother's silence had not been out of hatred but out of mercy. Evelyn Hale had chosen to protect her from a truth too heavy for a child to bear. As dawn broke again, Clara stepped out into the hallway for a breath of fresh air. The corridors were quiet, nurses moving gently like ghosts. Through the window, she could see the wet streets below, glistening under the soft glow of the rising Sunday. The city was waking, unaware that in this one small room, a chapter of 2 broken lives was nearing its end. Harris appeared in the waiting area, his hat in his hands, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "The lawyers came this morning," he said softly. "Mr. Hale asked for his will to be read today, before it is too late." Clara's heart tightened. "He does not have to do that now," she whispered, but Harris shook his head. He insisted. He said it is time for the truth to be complete. When she returned to the room, Richard was awake, his breathing shallow but his gaze steady. 2 men in suits stood quietly by the doorway, his legal advisors. Richard motioned for Clara to come closer. "There are papers that will be signed today," he said, his voice weak but clear. "They will cause anger. My son, Michael, will come. He will not understand. But you must promise me something." Clara frowned. "What is it?" "Do not hate him," Richard said. "He is the man I used to be, blind, proud, selfish. I do not want you to repeat my mistakes." She wanted to tell him that she could handle it, but a knot formed in her throat. Before she could answer, the door burst open. A tall man in his 30s strode in, his expression filled with fury and disbelief. "Father," he said sharply, "what is this I am hearing? You are changing your will? For her?" His gaze snapped to Clara, burning with accusation. "Who is this girl? Another one of your nurses? Or is she the reason you are suddenly so charitable?" Clara froze, her body trembling under his anger. Richard tried to speak, but the strain of emotion made his breath catch. Harris stepped forward, trying to calm the young man, but Michael brushed him aside. "You think this stranger deserves anything? After what you built, after what Mother went through?" His voice cracked, but his rage did not falter. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Please," she said gently, "you should not talk to him like that. He is not well." Michael turned on her. "Do not pretend to care. I know what people like you want. Money. That is all." Before Richard could stop him, Michael reached for the documents on the bedside table. Clara instinctively stepped between them, clutching the folder to her chest. "Do not," she said quietly, her voice shaking but firm. For a moment, the room went still. The 2 lawyers exchanged nervous glances. Then Richard spoke, his tone cutting through the tension. "Enough," he said, his voice frail but commanding. "Michael, sit down." The son froze, shocked by the authority still left in his dying father's words. Richard took a slow breath. "You do not know everything," he continued. "Clara is not a stranger. She is your sister." The words hung in the air like thunder. Michael's face turned pale as his eyes darted between them. "What?" he whispered. Richard's voice softened. "Your mother never knew. It was long before I married her. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I will not leave this world without making them right." Michael took a step back, his anger collapsing into disbelief. Clara stood frozen, the room spinning around her. The truth that had already broken her heart now broke his. Richard reached for both of them, his trembling hands open as if begging the universe for one final moment of forgiveness. "Do not let hate outlive me," he whispered. The air felt heavy with everything left unsaid, and the silence that followed was more powerful than any word. The silence that followed Richard Hale's confession was suffocating. Michael stood motionless, his hand frozen in midair, his face pale as if all the air had been pulled from the room. Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the space, slow and fragile, like the ticking of time running out. She wanted to speak, but could not find her voice. The man who had once shouted with anger now stared at her with disbelief, and beneath that disbelief, a flicker of something else, fear. "You are lying," Michael finally said, his voice trembling. "You are confused. She cannot be my sister." Richard's lips parted, and though his voice was weak, it carried the weight of truth. I wish I were lying, son. I wish this were not my sin to confess, but she is your blood. Her mother was Evelyn, the woman I betrayed before your mother ever knew me. Michael took a step back, shaking his head. This is madness. You are dying, and you are saying anything to ease your guilt. His voice rose, but the pain in his eyes betrayed the anger on his lips. All these years, you gave us nothing but absence, and now this? A maid? My sister? The word maid struck Clara like a blade. She lowered her gaze, the shame and confusion burning through her chest. Richard coughed violently, the strain of emotion too much for his weakened body. Clara rushed to his side, holding a tissue to his lips, her hand trembling. When he finally stopped coughing, he reached for her wrist and whispered, "Do not let him carry my hate. Please." Michael turned away, running a hand through his hair. His jaw tightened as he struggled to breathe through the storm inside him. Harris stepped forward cautiously, his voice gentle. "Mr. Hale, perhaps we should let your father rest. This is too much for today." But Richard shook his head. "No, the truth has waited too long. It must be said now." He looked at his son, the corners of his eyes glistening. "I have built empires, bought power, destroyed people's lives just to keep what I thought mattered. But when I saw Clara caring for me without knowing who I was, I realized something I never understood before. Love cannot be bought or begged. It is given freely, even to those who do not deserve it." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Michael's shoulders slumped, the anger in him collapsing into exhaustion. For the first time, he looked at Clara not as an intruder, but as a living reminder of everything his father had hidden. "If this is true," he said quietly, "then what happens now?" Richard smiled faintly, his hand still holding Clara's. "Now, I leave this world in peace. And you two, you decide whether my bloodline ends with bitterness or begins again with forgiveness." The tension in the room seemed to dissolve into a fragile calm. Michael stared at the floor for a long moment, then let out a slow, unsteady breath. He turned toward Clara, his expression softening. "I do not know how to process this," he admitted, "but I can see that you did not come here for money." Clara shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I came here because he asked me to. Because he was dying, and I could not turn away." Michael nodded slowly. "Then maybe that is enough." Richard's eyes closed for a moment, a faint smile crossing his lips. "That is all I ever wanted," he murmured. His breathing grew shallower, his grip weaker, but the peace on his face was undeniable. The storm that had raged within him for decades had finally quieted. Harris moved quietly toward the door to give them privacy, but Richard's voice stopped him. "Wait," he said softly. "There is one last thing." He motioned toward the folder on the bedside table. Michael opened it and found a letter addressed to both him and Clara. The envelope was sealed with wax, his father's initials pressed into the surface. Richard took one final breath and said, "When I am gone, read it together. You will understand." His eyes drifted toward the window where a thin line of sunlight cut through the clouds, touching the edge of his blanket. For the first time since she met him, Clara saw no fear in his face, only relief. And when the light grew brighter, Richard Hale exhaled one last time and was still. The machines flatlined softly, and the room fell into the kind of silence that only comes when a soul finally lets go. The sound of the heart monitor faded into a single long tone before the nurse quietly stepped forward to turn it off. Clara stood frozen beside the bed, her fingers still entwined with Richard Hale's cold hand. The stillness in the room felt heavy, sacred, and final. Michael stared at his father's lifeless body, his expression blank, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. For years, he had seen his father as untouchable, a man carved from stone and power. Now that figure was gone, replaced by silence and fragility. Clara took a trembling breath and whispered, "He is gone." The words broke something inside her, and tears streamed down her face. Michael turned slowly toward her. For a moment, the tension between them returned the unspoken question of what would happen next, but then his gaze softened. The anger that had once burned in him had vanished, replaced by confusion and guilt. "He wanted us to read the letter together," Clara said quietly. Michael nodded, his voice barely audible. "Then we should honor that." Harris stood in the doorway, his hat pressed against his chest, tears glistening in his old eyes. He had served the Hale family for more than 40 years, but at that moment, he looked like a man who had just lost a piece of himself. He stepped closer, placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder, and said softly, "He found peace because of you." Later that evening, After the doctors had completed their formalities and the body had been taken to the family estate, Clara and Michael found themselves sitting together in the mansion's west study, the same room where she had first uncovered the truth. The fire crackled quietly in the fireplace, its light casting long shadows on the walls. The letter lay on the desk between them, the wax seal unbroken. Michael reached for it and hesitated. "Would you like to open it?" he asked. Clara nodded slowly. Her fingers shook as she peeled away the seal and unfolded the paper. Richard's handwriting was uneven but clear. She began to read aloud. "To my children," the letter began. "If you are reading this, I have finally found the courage to face the truth I ran from for decades. I built my empire on power and control, but in doing so, I destroyed the very people who tried to love me. Michael, you grew up believing that strength meant never showing weakness. I taught you that lie, and for that, I am sorry. True strength is not domination, it is forgiveness. Clara, you gave me peace I never deserved. You reminded me of the gentleness your mother carried in her heart. I cannot undo the pain I caused, but I hope this truth sets you free from the shadow of my mistakes. Do not let my sins separate you. Blood bound by forgiveness is stronger than any inheritance. Love each other. Live the life I was too afraid to live." By the time she finished reading, her voice was breaking. The firelight flickered in Michael's eyes, reflecting something fragile remorse. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "He was right," he said quietly. "I spent my whole life trying to be like him, and now I see how blind I was." Clara folded the letter gently, her tears falling onto the paper. "He was not all bad," she whispered. "He was just lost." Michael gave a faint, sorrowful nod. "We all are, in some way." They sat there in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. For the first time, they were not enemies, not strangers divided by circumstance, but two people bound by the same broken history. Harris entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea, his hands trembling slightly. "He would have wanted you both to stay here tonight," he said. "The house feels less empty when there is family inside it." The word family lingered in the air. Clara looked around the grand study. The room that once felt cold and intimidating now seemed gentler, softer. She took a deep breath and said, "Tomorrow we will plan his farewell. But tonight, let us just be his children." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, the Hale mansion was not filled with tension or command. It was filled with something quiet and rare understanding. And as the wind outside rustled the old trees, it felt as if the house itself sighed with relief, releasing decades of grief into the night. The morning of Richard Hale's funeral arrived with a soft fog settling over the city. The Hale estate, usually guarded and cold, seemed different that day, quiet, reverent, and almost human. The garden was filled with white lilies, the same kind Clara used to place by his bedside every morning. A few close associates and family friends attended, most wearing expressions that mixed sorrow with curiosity. Rumors had already spread that the billionaire had rewritten his will in his final days, leaving everything not to his business empire or charity foundations, but to someone no one expected. As the priest's voice echoed over the marble courtyard, Clara stood beside Michael, her black dress simple yet graceful. She kept her eyes on the casket, unable to shake the image of the fragile man who had found peace only in his last breath. Harris stood a few steps behind them, his shoulders slightly hunched, the weight of years pressing down on him. When the final prayer ended, the lawyer stepped forward to address those gathered. "Per Mr. Hale's last instructions," he began, his tone formal, "a private reading of his will shall be conducted immediately after this ceremony, in the west study of the estate." A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. Clara felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had already read his last words in the letter, yet this moment still carried an air of finality. Inside the mansion, the fire had been relit in the study, casting a warm glow across the polished mahogany table. The lawyer unfolded the document carefully, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Hale's estate, assets, and remaining holdings are hereby transferred to a newly established foundation named the Evelyn Trust," he read aloud. "This trust shall be jointly overseen by Clara Hale and Michael Hale, to be used exclusively for charitable purposes, specifically to fund shelters and hospices for the elderly and terminally ill." The room fell silent. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching in disbelief. Michael turned toward her, equally stunned. The lawyer continued, "It was Mr. Hale's wish that his wealth, which once brought him power and pride, would now bring comfort to those facing their final days. He believed that redemption cannot be inherited, it must be shared. Clara covered her mouth with her hand, tears forming in her eyes. It was not the inheritance she expected, nor was it something she ever asked for. But it was right. It was him trying to heal, even in death. Michael let out a shaky breath, his voice soft but steady. He wanted us to build something better than what he left behind. She nodded, her tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. Then we will. After the reading, most of the guests left, leaving only the two of them and Harris in the fading afternoon light. The house, once a fortress of ego and loneliness, now felt like a place where something good might finally begin. Harris approached them with a small box. "He wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to Clara. Inside was the old pocket watch Richard used to carry, the same one he kept beside him even in the hospital. The back was engraved with the words, "Time heals when the heart forgives." Clara held it tightly, her reflection glinting off the gold surface. For a long moment, she said nothing, then whispered, "He was right." Michael looked out the window toward the garden where their father had been laid to rest. "You know," he said quietly, "he never let me touch that watch when I was a child. He said it was a reminder that time was his only enemy." Clara gave a faint, sad smile. "Now it is his peace." They stood together, watching the sun dip low beyond the hills. For the first time, there was no bitterness, no resentment, only the quiet understanding that they had both been given a chance to start over. As evening fell, Clara walked through the empty halls, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly. She stopped at the doorway of the study, looking back one last time before turning off the lights. The mansion, once a monument to pride, now belonged to forgiveness. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lilies, as if whispering a final farewell. Somewhere in that gentle silence, Clara could almost hear his voice, calm, free, and at peace. Several months passed after the funeral, and the Hale mansion no longer felt like a place of sorrow. It had been transformed, both inside and out. The once cold marble floors now echoed with footsteps of volunteers and nurses. The grand chandelier that used to symbolize luxury now glimmered softly over patients resting in warmth and safety. The Evelyn Trust had come to life. Under Clara and Michael's care, the estate became a hospice for the terminally ill, a place where no one had to face their final days alone. The decision had not been easy. Many in the business world questioned why the heirs of a billionaire would devote his fortune to strangers, but Clara and Michael never sought to explain. They understood what their father had wanted. It was not redemption through wealth, but redemption through kindness. Every morning, Clara would walk through the garden with a small basket of fresh lilies, placing one by each bedside. Sometimes she would sit with the patients, listening to their stories, holding their hands the way she once held his. The peace in their eyes reminded her that forgiveness was not something you said once, it was something you lived every day. Michael, on the other hand, had left the corporate boardrooms behind. He now spent his time managing the foundation's logistics, learning humility one task at a time. The siblings had grown close in a way that neither expected. They did not speak much about the past anymore. The pain had not vanished, but it had softened into something bearable, something that guided rather than haunted them. One evening, as the sun dipped low across the estate, Clara stood at the edge of the garden, watching the light shimmer across the small pond where her father's ashes had been scattered. The water was calm, reflecting the golden sky like glass. Harris approached slowly, his hands folded behind his back, his steps measured and gentle. "You have done something beautiful here, Miss Clara," he said softly. He would be proud. She turned to him and smiled faintly. "I think he finally found peace," she replied. "And maybe, in a way, so did we." Harris nodded, his old eyes glistening. "You gave him a better ending than he deserved. That is what forgiveness truly is." The sound of laughter drifted from inside the house, volunteers sharing stories, nurses preparing evening tea. The mansion, once filled with echoes of greed and loneliness, now breathed with life. Clara glanced down at the pocket watch in her hand, the same one her father had given her. The engraving caught the last rays of the sunset. "Time heals when the heart forgives." She whispered the words to herself like a prayer. For the first time, they did not hurt. They comforted. Later that night, she went to her small room on the upper floor. It was the same room she used to clean as a maid, now filled with books, flowers, and soft lamplight. On the desk lay an envelope addressed to her in her mother's handwriting, one she had found, while sorting through old belongings. She opened it carefully and read the single line inside. "If love finds you in the place where I lost mine, do not run from it." Tears welled in her eyes as she folded the note and pressed it against her heart. Downstairs, Michael was turning off the lights in the study. When he looked up, he saw a portrait of their father that Clara had hung near the fireplace. For the first time, he did not see the man who had ruined their childhoods, but a man who had tried, in the end, to be better. He whispered, "Rest now, father. We will take it from here." Outside, the night settled over the estate, quiet and serene. The lilies swayed gently in the wind, carrying their sweet scent into the open sky. And in that stillness, Clara closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that every story, no matter how tragic, can end in peace when the heart chooses forgiveness. The mansion lights dimmed one by one until only the garden lamps remained, their soft glow stretching into the darkness like small promises that love, once found, never truly fades.